Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Sermon. I'm Matt Hotho, the Director of Production and Online Engagement at Hyde United Methodist.
And I'm Magrey, the Senior Pastor.
Well, Magrey, we made it through another sermon series. Yes, and this one is a book that you wrote.
I know.
So give us a recap of the book and maybe where we can buy it and listen to it and all those good things.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm just so grateful that we decided to use the book. So here's what was interesting about this one. A lot of the other books that I've written come out of worship series that I'd already preached at Hyde Park. So it really has never made sense to do a study of one of my books when the congregation has already experienced it when it was a sermon series. This is different. This is one that was generated not based on a prior worship series at Hyde Park, but something that was almost entirely original when the publisher asked me to write an Advent study. And I came up with this really wild idea about doing it based on the epistles and not the gospels. And the editor came back and forth to do some tweaking and revising. It turned into a book that was not based on a prior worship series. So anyway, it was just nice to be able to do a worship series that was based on an original book rather than vice versa. And I hope folks enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, I think it was a really enjoyable series. And you're right. I mean, it's nice to sort of have your Christmas story not just be based on the gospel retellings of it. So recap for us the 4 Sundays that we covered in the book.
So they were all based on epistles that give us an earliest glimpse in how the church was wrestling with this idea of Jesus being fully God and fully human and what that means for us in our everyday life. So the first one was based on Romans, where we get this idea of the prophets foretelling the coming of the Messiah. And how Jesus, through his life and death and resurrection, was the bridge between us and God, saving us from sin. That's all from Romans. The second was from 1 John, which I ran some parallels between the Epistle of John, the Gospel of John, the book of Genesis, talking about how Jesus was the full incarnation of God's love. That was really kind of the key word for week 2 of how Jesus fully embodied love for us, and that we can be loving and truthful. It's really the juxtaposition of those two ideas that's necessary for everyday life. We can hold our truth lovingly. We need to speak our truth with love. Because if you have one without the other, there's an imbalance to the kind of life that we're supposed to live. In week 3, it was based on Philippians, really one of my most favorite New Testament books, where we talk about the full humanity of Jesus. Philippians chapter 2 talks about Jesus emptying himself of being fully God in order to experience all that it was to be human, including being obedient to death on the cross, and how that can prompt us to live with empathy, curiosity, and humility, to live out the fullness of our humanity in service to God and others. And then, as you heard in the sermon today, it's about the full divinity of Jesus and how Colossians really gives us the fullest, most complete early vision of Jesus pre-existing the historical figure. When that woman asked me, where was Jesus before he was born? That's a really mind-blowing question for us today, certainly was for the early Christians and the early Christian thinkers, and even Martin Luther King Jr., as I said, wrestled with that idea of how Jesus was God before he was human. That's just mind-blowing to think about. But more importantly, as I've tried to do in this whole series, what does that mean for us today? What impact does Jesus' full divinity have for us? And as I said, when we live into the example of Jesus, we can see God more fully through our actions.
So when we live into the example of Jesus, we can see God more fully through our actions. So we see God through good human actions, essentially, right?
Right. Because as the way Dr. King formulated it in his mind, it was Jesus' intentional, conscious choices to reflect God in every option, in every moment. That is an example for us as to how we can fully reveal God's intentions and God's heart through our very own actions. We can actually be an incarnate image of God, not the incarnate image of God. That's relegated solely to Jesus, who did it perfectly. We will never do it perfectly, but when we do it well, we can be an incarnate reflection of God's full intentions for the world.
Yeah, I think those are big ideas. And
Right.
I think, well, and what I mean by that is I think that's why, in the last 2 weeks, the scriptures that we chose were hymns. I mean, they were early
Yeah.
Christian
Oh, good point.
hymns because they needed to be internalized, right? Just
Right.
like our own hymnody helps us internalize key beliefs about God's grace, about God's sovereignty, about all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
These early Christian hymns were preserved and recorded because I think they help the community remember these specific ideas about who Jesus is and this balance.
I think that's a wonderful point, that our songs, particularly as Methodists, as Wesleyan people, we sing our theology.
Mm-hmm.
Other denominations do too, but in our DNA, we sing our theology. My friend Paul Chilcote, who's a professor of Wesleyan studies, once reminded me and others in a meeting that the word orthodoxy, which we often ascribe to this sort of first order, high order language about theology, that orthodoxy at its core means right praise.
Mm-hmm.
Ortho meaning correct or right, and doxology meaning praise.
Right.
And so theology at its core is not just thinking cerebral thoughts and highfalutin language about things. It is orienting our praise to God. And that's why there's so much compatibility between theology and, as you said, hymnody, the way we sing. And I never thought of it that way. That's why two of the most formative theological statements in all of Paul's letters were actually adaptations of hymns, Philippians 2 and Colossians 1. I think that's very, very accurate.
Yeah. So I think for us today, and we can talk about this for a little bit as we kind of wrap up, is this idea of why is it so important to preserve the full humanity and the full divinity of Jesus? I mean, I know we talked about this over the summer. I almost hesitated to bring this up today because it's like, well, we want to go here again. But the more I thought about it, it's like, this is a key idea for really understanding what it means to also have the right practices, for thinking the right, we're not only thinking the right way, but behaving the right way, right? I mean, if Jesus is not human and is just God, then there's nothing we can really learn from Jesus in some ways.
Right.
And if Jesus is only human and isn't God, then what was God doing? Where was God then? And so why is it important to make sure that we preserve Jesus' humanity and his divinity?
That's a great question. So my favorite theology professor in seminary, Tyrone Inbody, posed it to us this way in class. He said, theology contains everything we need for salvation, nothing more or nothing less. And what he meant by that was the whole history of theological belief is a formulation of ideas that create what we need in order to be saved, and nothing more than that and nothing less than that. And I think what we call the Christological formula, the idea of Jesus being fully human and fully divine, is a great example of that. That if Jesus were less than fully human or less than fully divine, in some way, some compromise between the two, that would not offer us salvation, at least in the way that we understand it as Christian people. We need Jesus to be fully human and fully divine in order for us to be saved. Why is that? Because a fully divine God would have no way of relating to us as human beings or offering to us anything that is approachable for us in terms of salvation. And a fully human God, who is not fully divine, couldn't do anything for us that we could not do for ourselves. Mm-hmm. We would have no need for God in that moment. So there needs to be some way of Jesus being fully both without compromising either. And frankly, that's one of many examples of mystery in the Christian faith that is beyond our intellect, because if it were fully comprehensible, fully understandable, it would be satisfying to us, but it would negate any need for God in that way. So having something that is at a distance to our limitations also makes it appropriate for us in terms of our salvation.
Yeah, it maintains the mystery.
Right.
Which puts the distance between it, which makes it something that you guys often just have to just be in awe of.
And take by faith.
Yeah. And that's where faith comes
in. I know that often puts us at odds with those who really want to claim reason and intellect and scientific method. And our position always is, as United Methodists, that there is no incompatibility between faith and reason. There is a way for both to be at work within their own fields of understanding. But to make faith entirely understandable would negate the power of faith.
Yeah.
As Anne Lamott has said, one of my favorite Christian authors, doubt is not the opposite of faith. Certainty is the opposite of faith. And so there needs to be some stretchability in faith that makes us realize just how limited we are in the face of such unknown.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Magrey.
Yeah.
So as you are reflecting on this past sermon series, maybe going back and listening to old episodes in the series, or maybe reading Magrey's book, we hope that you'll find throughout the 4 letters that are contained within the Christmas letters a respect for the mystery of this whole thing, about how Jesus came to earth, how God came to earth in Jesus to save us, to save humanity, to be a representation on earth of what it means to live life as God intends it. So we hope you'll take that with you as you go into this holiday season. We hope you have a Merry Christmas. We will be back on January 5th, so you won't see us next week. Oh,
and then, since this is the last Beyond the Sermon of the Advent season and the last Beyond the series of the Christian year, of this calendar year, we hope you've enjoyed the little Easter eggs that are all throughout the communication studio.
Yeah.
Happy ho 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 though.
Thank you. This is a fun little treat I got from my dad. Someone made it for him when he was a young buck in his first office gig. Someone crocheted it for him.
Anyway, I interrupted you saying that there will not be a Beyond the Sermon for December 29th.
Sorry. Yeah, there will not be a Beyond the Sermon for December 29th. We'll be back on January 5th to start a new series called Living Life Inspired. So we'll have more for you about that series, and you can join us then online or in person. We'll see you then. Adios.